Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear us okay. We'll be joined very shortly, as always, on our Monday night history sessions by our local Lowestoft historian, Mr. Ivan Bunn. If you're watching us tonight on YouTube, or if you're watching us tonight on Facebook, you are able to comment and let us know what you think, which is exactly what Chris Collins has done. She says, evening, Ivan, Stephen, and Paul, and all. And she's speaking to everybody else that's watching. So far, there's about 14, I think, watching. And I'm going to say good evening to Chris Collins. Thank you very much. As I said, she's saying good evening to all of you, and we would absolutely love it if you can say hello to each other. It just keeps that feeling of community nice and strong, which is exactly what Jerry Poole has done as well. She says hello all. Hello, Jerry. Lovely to know that you're both out there, you and Chris. And another fantastic couple of people is my favourites, the Drapers, Jackie and Barry. They say evening all, and I say evening, Jackie, evening, Barry. We're going to be coming to the history sessions very shortly, but I like to prattle on for a few minutes just to make sure that everybody that wants to tune in is doing so. So that will either be, as I said, on YouTube. You can catch us on our Rogues Shanty Chorus channel, or you can catch us on Facebook via our Facebook page, the Rogues Shanty Chorus, or the Rogues Shanty Boys, or our parent organisation, the Voice Cloud. Now, if you're wondering what on earth is this Rogues Shanty Chorus business, I'll tell you. The Rogues Shanty Chorus is a group of people, and what we do is we meet to celebrate the unique coastal cultural heritage of Waveney and the East Coast. So the Lowestoft area, but expanded just a little bit. Now, the Rogues Shanty Chorus, they look a little bit like this. This is our wonderful group of singers. Most of them, they actually number a little bit bigger than that, but on this particular performance at the Seagull Theatre, where we normally meet, they were just diminished by just a few. But this is our wonderful bunch of singers. And we meet every other Tuesday, normally when we can, at the Seagull Theatre, which is in Pakefield, which is the south end of Lowestoft. And as I said, we celebrate the unique coastal cultural heritage of Waveney and the East Coast, and the associated genre of sea shanties, part of the folk genre, that would have been sung by the fishermen and by the people involved in the fishing industry along the East Coast, and a little bit abroad, further around the country as well. We like to broaden it out to make sure that we understand the cultural heritage. I think I've said that just a few times now. Now, we are funded very kindly by People's Health Trust. So hopefully you can see down here, there's some logos. They've been very kind to fund our project for just about a year now, and they funded it before this current period as well. And they've kept us going through, not just through lockdown, but also through this social distance period, to make sure that we're able to cultivate and encourage that feeling of community, to keep engaged with our regular rogues, as I said, such as the Drapers, but also people that have tuned in along the way, such as Jerry Poole, and people that might even want to join us at some point, such as Chris Collins. Now, I wonder which one Linda Boyce fits into. She says, evening one and all, and we say, good evening, Linda. Thank you very much for tuning in. Now, we've got a fantastic talk and presentation, as always, presented by Mr. Ivan Bunn. Tonight, it will be called The Witchfinders of Suffolk and Norfolk. So it's a very spooky, eerie feel to the evening. If you believe that these young women, as they often were in fact witches, or perhaps the eerie and spooky nature will be of the kind of attitudes that were imparted usually by men upon these fatal young ladies. So we'll be back in 2 weeks, which is Monday the 12th of October, with episode 18. That'll be entitled Aspects of Lowestoft's History, and that'll be a much broader overview of Lowestoft. As I said, Lowestoft is our kind of our focus and our base, and the rest of the East Coast. And Ivan has done a few talks moving a little bit around Lowestoft, such as Colville and Alton Broad, and those kind of areas. But this will be a much more overview of Lowestoft history. But as I said, tonight, something a little bit more specific with episode 17, which will be the Witchfinders of Suffolk and Norfolk. What I'm going to do, just before I invite Ivan back on, I'm going to change the surrounds that I've managed to put on because I had the wrong one. You can see up here the Lowestoft History Sessions with Ivan Bunn, episode 17. But if you fancy some of the sea shanties from the Rogues Shanty Chorus, please do tune in the same time tomorrow, Tuesday, and I will be joined by Sally Hardman, one of our regular rogues. She might even be tempted to sing us a couple of songs, and we'll be talking about how we are planning to get going again and be meeting with our rogues once again in person. That will be coming up very soon, October the 13th. And we're very much looking forward to that, assuming nothing changes in regard to governmental advice. So fingers crossed that we'll be able to get back and meet most of our rogues in a socially distanced manner. But without any further ado, because I know that this wonderful and deeply interesting talk will need a little bit of an explanation and a lead up, I'm going to welcome Mr. Ivan Bunn. Hello, Ivan. How are you, my man?
Sorry, it caught me off guard there. I'm good, thank you, Stephen. Good evening, everybody, particularly to Chris and Jerry, Jackie, Barry, Linda, and everybody else. Hopefully are out there watching. Right, where do I start? Yeah, as we just said, tonight I'm going to try and hopefully succeed in looking at the activities of two notorious witch finders that were active in this area in 1645 and 46. It's going to be difficult, basically, because the amount of information that I have to share with you, there we go. This is the end product of my research.
Wow.
I can't cram all of that into an hour and a bit, obviously. I'll explain exactly what's in here as we go through the talk. It's going to be easier to do that as we go through, rather than me sit here now and burble on for hours and hours trying to explain how I managed to put this talk together. As I'm sure many of you know, English witchcraft in the 16th and 17th century is my forte, for want of a better word. And that all came about because of my interest initially in the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Cullender, the so-called Lowestoft witches, of which I think the talk that I gave on that subject, don't know how long ago it was and how the time goes too quickly, but that should still be available. But this has gone back and looking at a much broader picture, and I became interested in the Lowestoft witch trial and suddenly realized that that was a tiny pinprick in the amount of material there was out there historically about witchcraft trials in England. I stress England. Scotland had their own judicial system and their own way of prosecuting and finding witches, as they did in Europe. England was pretty unique in the way they went about things. And so, of course, my research actually spilled over into New England to see in the 17th century how what was happening here was taken with the immigrants into New England, culminating, of course, in the Salem witch trials. So that's kind of how I kind of be where I am and why I'm giving this talk tonight. So I think probably because I've been spending the best part of a week putting this together, hopefully to make a pretty smooth hopefully quite slick, and hopefully so Stephen doesn't have to click a button every 2 or 3 minutes to keep changing the slides. So I think I'm getting it down to a fine art now. So anyway, welcome everybody. It's nice to be here. I tell you what, I'm just beginning to wish now I hadn't put the heating on earlier. It's getting a bit warm in here, but never mind. So I think with no more ado, conscious of the time slowly passing, we'll get on with tonight's talk.
We will. Okay, Ivan, just while I strip the screens down, I'll just remind everybody something that you mentioned just a little while ago, which was that all of Ivan's talks are still available to view either on Facebook or on YouTube. But obviously tonight we want to just keep your attention for this wonderful talk that Ivan and presentation that Ivan has put together for tonight. So as Ivan said, I'm going to take myself out of this and share the fantastic presentation.
Yeah, so here we go then. Tonight's talk, it's got two titles really, I suppose. The first title, hopefully, if this thing works right, and it worked a few minutes ago when Stephen and I tested it, so we hope it's going to be smooth with no glitches. This is where I sit with here we go. I've called it In the Wake of the Witchfinders. The Witchfinders, one of whom I think many of you out there will have heard of. The Witchfinders in question this evening, possibly the most notorious and really the only Witchfinders that we know of in 17th century England. So we're going to walk in the footsteps in the wake of two of the witchfinders who were very active in this area in 1645-46, Matthew Hopkins and John Sterne, in Suffolk and Norfolk, 1645 to 1646. But before we actually tackle them as people and look at their activities, we just need to do, as I've done before, just a little bit of background to the story from a legal point of view. Witchcraft wasn't heresy in this country. It wasn't against the law to be a witch. It was only against the law if you were proved to be a witch and you would use your witchcraft to bewitch, kill, maim people or goods. And Matthew Hopkins and John Sterne, the witchfinders, were able to do what they did under the Witchcraft Act of 1604, an act against conjuration, witchcrafts, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits. It's a felony. It's like murder, rape, arson. It had to be tried in the highest courts. And there was a due process. Now, coming up on the screen is very, 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 very simplified. The due process that had to be gone through to get somebody to the assize court to be tried. So if I just talk you through what's coming up on the screen very, very briefly. So if somebody thought that their neighbour was a felon, in this case, a practicing witchcraft who'd done harm, they would complain to a local magistrate. If the magistrate felt there was a case to be answered, he would issue an arrest for the accused witch in this case. He would, within a short while after that, he would go to the town or village or city even and listen to the complaints made by everybody. At that hearing, where the complainants would say why they thought X, Y, and Z were witches, a magistrate had to be there to make notes. And if and it isn't a case of if. Now, it's very important to bear in mind here now that once the magistrate had issued a warrant for the arrest, he could not discharge that person. The due process of law had to go ahead right the way through until they got to the assize court, where the notes made by the magistrate's clerk would be given to the grand jury. We had a grand jury system back then. The notes would be given to the grand jury, all men, usually 16 or more, and in private they would listen to the evidence given against the two accused. They would then decide whether that person should go to the court of Oyer and Terminer, the Crown Court, to stand trial, or whether it was a load of tosh and they would throw out the charges and discharge the accused person. Now, the magistrate's notes are very, very important in the case of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, because they exist. We don't have the records from the trials that ensued, but we do have the notes of what accusations were made. And once we get into this evening, I intend to run through just a few. Those notes that I showed you here at the beginning, that big folder of mine, there's 139 copies of the original magistrate clerk's notes, noting down quite briefly and sometimes almost indecipherably what evidence was given to the magistrate that X, Y, and Z were witches. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. So as I said, bear in mind there is a due process going on here. This is not just kangaroo courts and lynch mobs. This is the due process of law under the Witchcraft Act of 1604. So as I say, if we move on to the next slide, please. So here is a contemporary woodcut showing a magistrate taking, not necessarily a witch trial, but taking evidence, having arrested somebody as a felon. We'll assume in this case it's a witch, and you can see two of the witnesses at the desk, one on his knees, giving his evidence to the magistrates. There on the left-hand side, you can see the magistrate's clerk making the notes that would follow the accused and the witnesses to the assize court. Assize courts were only held twice a year. They were a very, very important part of the English legal system. Magistrates, or justices of the peace as they were called, were usually fairly high-ranking individuals in the community, but they had no legal training. So they could get copies of a book like this one, the Country Justice, published in 1616, which would give all the different felonies and in the law books and explain what would be allowed as evidence and what wouldn't be allowed as evidence. So, and this page, in actual fact, you probably can't read it very well, but the bottom half is all the evidence that was permissible in witchcraft accusations. If the accused before the grand jury hears all the evidence, they decide that there is a case to be answered, they would draw up the indictments. These were formal documents that were used in the court. And here's some indictments from the witch trials in Great Yarmouth, which I'm going to come on to in a little while. they're in red. This is the trial of one Maria Blackburn of Great Yarmouth. And in the margin to the left, you can see the notes made by the clerk of the court, given the outcome. Both of these witches here was shown, were found to be guilty and were hanged. Again, I'm coming back to that. At the moment, what I'm endeavouring to do is paint the overall picture of what's going on. You'll see in little writing underneath most of these documents the references where the document original can be found in either the Norfolk or Suffolk Record Office, if anybody wanted to follow these up, if and when we're ever able to get back to record offices again. And the other thing it's worth noting that everything had to be written on the indictments formally in Latin. So these documents are all in Latin. So we've got this due process, just to go through again, and that you make a complaint to a magistrate thinks it's a good one, he upholds it, gets the person you're accusing arrested, he listens to the evidence against them, his clerk draws up the notes, and then they have to be sent for trial at the next county assize. The county assizes were held twice a year. There was the Easter assize, obviously held around Easter, then the summer assize held in usually towards the end of August. Only 2 assize courts. So if you were accused of being a felon a week after the Easter assize, you would then have to wait probably from the end of April or whenever April fell in that year, right through to August in jail before your case could be heard at the summer assize. So we'll push on to the next slides because we really need to go a little bit more in depth in this. Now, remember, it's not possible. Matthew Hopkins didn't actually make the accusations themselves. They did in some cases, but in most cases, they were able to go to a town or a parish and instruct the people the due process. And people believed in witchcraft. This is a spell that was held as evidence in the Norwich trial for witchcraft in 1646. And of course, as always, there's this plethora of publications. Here's just a tiny example of some of the pamphlets that were readily available, most of them supporting the fact that witches existed. So it's worth bearing in mind that Matthew Hopkins and John Stern as witchfinders could not have done what they did without a belief in witchcraft itself amongst ordinary people. So we'll come on now to look at who these witchfinders were. We don't have a lot of information. The main one was Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled Witchfinder General. More about his role as Witchfinder General. So what do we know about his background? Who was he? There's very, very little that's known about him. Here is a very, very simple family tree I've been able to put together based on what evidence I can find. We'll just let the screen fill up with pictures and words, and then I'll talk you through what you're looking at. So his father, James Hopkins, was the son of William Hopkins and Martha Saunders, all born in the late 16th century. We know that James had 6 sons, but we only know the names of 3 of them. Again, I'll come back to why that should be. The most important thing to remember is that James Hopkins, Matthew's father, was in fact the rector of St John's Church at Great Wenham in Suffolk. If you're ever that way, it's a nice little church to go visit. And immediately opposite the church, the other side of the lane, is Great Wenham Rectory. And it's here in Great Wenham Rectory that Matthew Hopkins was almost certainly born. I'll come a little bit more as to when he was born. We don't have a date for his birth. The reason being is the parish registers of Great Wenham don't go back that far recording baptisms. But his father was the Reverend James. We're pretty certain of that. I'll explain later why that's the case. And we know that his father was the rector of St John's Church at Great Wenham in Suffolk. And that Matthew was almost certainly born in the rectory there. If we go to the next slide, this is the interior of the church. This is where Matthew's dad would have preached. And we know from the evidence of the time, especially round about the time of the witch trial, that William Dowsing, who was a Puritan, an iconoclast, he went round smashing up all popish Roman Catholic images in churches. He comes to Great Wenham and he notes there was nothing there that he needed to get rid of. So we're pretty certain from that, that the Reverend James Hopkins was quite a Puritan when it came to religion. He wasn't high church at all. And probably Matthew Hopkins, who was almost certainly baptized in this font, was a Puritan himself. He had Puritan ideas rather than more high church ideas. So we go to the next slide. I just want to explain here a little bit how we come to a date approximately when Matthew Hopkins was born. Three of his earlier brothers we know were born before 1619 from another document where they were left some money as children for their father. There were three sons then, for their father to buy them a Bible each when they were able to read. James Hopkins himself died in January 1634, and this is the first page of his will. In it, he mentions his six sons. He mentions two by name. We know the name of the third one. We don't know the names of the other three, except that one was almost certainly Matthew Hopkins. So this is Matthew Hopkins is not mentioned in 1619, so he must have been born after 1619, 1620, 1621. And so this means in 1645-46, he was, assuming even if he was born in 1619, he was no older than 27 years old. He wasn't an elderly old man. And I think this contemporary drawing of him here gives the impression of a much younger man. The other thing worth bearing in mind, under the terms of the will, all the sons were left 100 marks. A mark was 13 shillings and fourpence. Doing some research, actually through the Bank of England website, I discovered that 100 marks in the mid-17th century would be the equivalent of about £7,500 today. So Matthew Hopkins was quite independent. And as far as we know, well, we're pretty certain he never married. So we've got this young man in his mid-20s, son of a parson, growing up in an isolated village in an area where there'd already been quite a lot of witch trials. quite well heeled, money-wise, venturing forth into the world. So where did he venture to? So if we go to the next slide, please, we quickly get through this. He moved to Manningtree. We don't know his occupation. It's possibly he was some form of small town lawyer, possibly like John Stern. He was a what they call a scrivener. That's a man who had a certain amount of legal knowledge. We know that he could read. We know that he could write. And he seems to have a knowledge of Latin as well. And according to, I think it's tradition more than anything else, if you look down South Street here in Manningtree, where he moved, you can see the line in there. The next house down, standing gable on to the road, is the house where supposedly Matthew Hopkins resided. He also, again, we're told, had either shares in or owned the Thorn Inn just up the road from Manningtree at Mistley. And this is where Matthew Hopkins discovered his first witches, in Manningtree and Mistley and in Essex, not in Suffolk, but in Essex. And there were some big trials there, which have to be the subject of a totally different talk. I'm focusing on Suffolk this evening. We know that he was signing some legal documents, and here's his signature taken from a legal document that he signed as a witness while at Manningtree. So he seems to have some sort of legal knowledge. He probably would have needed a knowledge of the law and the procedures to follow to get felons, in this case witches, to trial. So if we push on to the next slide, I've gone through this pretty quick because I want to get to the other one as well. Now, you can see here, he published in 1647. I want to talk more about this later, but he published in 1647. I got a copy here so I can actually read it to you. He published in 1647. If I just take this paper out of here. Okay. This booklet, A Discovery of Witches, justifying his activities in Norfolk and Suffolk in his witch hunting. And you can see he does it in a question and answer series. And the query number 3 is a rhetorical question, because he's writing the question and answer and himself. From whence then proceeded this skill, i.e. the skill to find witches? Was it from his profound learning, or from much reading of learned authors concerning the subject? And his answer to that was he got it from neither, but from experience, which though it be meanly esteemed of, yet the surest and safest way to judge by. And the answer, the questionnaire says, I pray, where was his experience gained, and why gained by him and not by others? Now, if we go to the next slide, he gives a long indication then. So here we are. This is from his book, his the Discovery of Witches, and he says that it was from his experience in Manningtree and the surrounding areas where he actually met with witches who were holding covens there. He saw their familiars that witches were supposed to have. And so he became very knowledgeable through his own experience in hunting, finding witches, that enabled him to go forth and do what he did with John Stern. And again, he tells us the discoverer himself never travelled far for it, but in March 1644, he had some 7 or 8 of that horrible sect of witches living in the town where he lived, a town in Essex called Manningtree, with divers, many other adjacent witches of other towns, who every 6 weeks in the night, been always on the Friday night, had their meeting close by his house and had several solemn sacrifices there offered to the devil. Hopkins says he actually experienced this himself and saw them. And bid them go to another witch, who was thereupon apprehended and searched by women who had for many years known the devil's marks. We'll come on to that in a moment, and found to have 3 teats about her, which honest women have not. So upon command from the justices, they were to keep her from sleep 2 or 3 nights, expecting in that time to see her familiars, which the 4th night she called in by their several names and told them what shapes. A quarter of an hour before they came in, there being 10 of us in the room, and the first she called in was. And here we get these wonderful names of these familiar spirits, these witches that he saw for himself. We've got Grizzle Greedy Gut, Pecking the Crown, Pie Whacker, Sack and Sugar, and there's the pictures. He's done engravings of the witches themselves, pointing out their familiars to him. But it's worth bearing in mind, first of all, he says the justices ordered this, so he's following the course of the law. He's managed to get the justices to arrest them and take hearings from them and collect the evidence. And in the end, there were 31 witches tried that year in Essex, all because of Matthew Hopkins and to a certain extent John Stern. And 121 witnesses gave evidence against them, including Hopkins and Stern on occasions, but mostly their neighbours of the witches were actually against. So we've got 31 witches who were tried, and 121 individuals, separate individuals in total during the trials came forward and gave evidence against these 31 witches. So there's evidence here that Hopkins and Stern could not have done what they did without the belief, the apparent belief of the ordinary folks in the towns and villages of their belief in the existence of witchcraft. Hopkins was very, very much into familiars. We'll come into familiars in a moment because I need to continue forward with this, conscious as time is passing. And so this is Matthew Hopkins justifying with hindsight that he became an experienced witch finder because of the actual hands-on experience he had as an individual, encountering witches, hearing their confessions, seeing, so he tells us, these strange familiars that they had. Now, Hopkins in his book calls himself Witchfinder General. It's worth pointing out that this is the title he gave himself. There has never been any evidence that anybody in authority, in the government, in the military, anywhere else, gave him this title. And it's not really, he's not a general in the military sense. He calls him a Witchfinder General. That means he's just going after witches in general. Any witches, he's going to go after them. And so he becomes Witchfinder General. Not the Witchfinder General, but Witchfinder General. I think that's important to whether he kind of pumped himself up with that title in the eyes of the people he was dealing with, we don't know. So if we push on again, we need to have another look at the other Witchfinder, John Stern. John Stern appears to have been a fair bit older than Hopkins, probably 10 years older. He tells us he was originally from Manningtree, and He was a married man. He got married here in the Church of the Holy Trinity at Long Melford. It was on the 24th of January 1637 where he married Agnes Boston. They were married here at the Holy Trinity Church in Melford. By 1644, we know that he probably moved from Manningtree and was living in the village of Lawshall, not far from Bury St Edmunds. So we've got Matthew Hopkins living in Manningtree, at one point where Sterne had lived, but Sterne seems to have moved after marrying a young lady from Long Melford in her parish church. He seems eventually to have settled in Lawshall. That's quite important, as we shall see in a moment. So if we push on a little bit, next slide. This is the village of Lawshall. I don't know if that's John Sterne's house or not. Again, we'll see, was quite literate. He could read and write, and he himself published a booklet justifying what he did. Again, I'll come on to that in a short while. So as I say, Matthew Hopkins there. So he was obviously very religious. You could see here, this is his book that he wrote, 61 pages of it, and he is obviously very religious, because in that book there's 197 quotes from the Bible noted to justify what he did. And he describes it, there's his signature as well, rather a flamboyant signature. And he justifies what he did by saying he was just a plain man. But when you read through this book, it's a pretty garbled thing. He's obviously read The Guide to Grand Jurymen, which was an extensive book published by Richard Bernard, and where he gives all sorts of details about witches, where to find them, who they were, what they did, how to prosecute them. And he plagiarizes lots of sections from this earlier Guide to Grand Jurymen that he puts into his confirmation book. And he also then pads it out with his own observations and also details of the many witches that he had dealings with, that he had discovered, and in many cases was responsible for getting them to court and their eventual execution. So that's John Sterne. We know very, very little else about the man. So these are the two guys that, after strutting their stuff in Essex, where at Chelmsford, at the trial of the Essex witches, as we shall call them, of John Sterne and Matthew Hopkins, 20 of them were executed. Many, many more were found, but 20 finished up being found guilty and executed. Shall we move on now to the next slide, please? There were also, again, Hopkins mentions them by name. There might have been more. He had two search women that accompanied him round the area. Possibly Sterne had some as well, but he doesn't mention them. Mary Phillips, widow Phillips, and Frances Mills. Now, the accused witches were supposed to have witches' marks, supernumerary teats or nipples on their bodies, from which they fed their familiars. And so, of course, back in the 17th century, it would be unheard of for men to intimately search women for these marks that could be anywhere. And so he employed women, these probably midwives, to search the women. So we got Mary Phillips and Frances Mills. Now, almost nothing about them. Mary Phillips does crop up a little bit later in the talk. We'll come on to her. So basically, this is the team, if you want a better word for them, of witch finders that actually come from Essex over the border in the spring of 1645 and start to discover the witches in Suffolk. So we move to the next slide, please. So this is their move into Suffolk. Let's see now the big picture of where they conducted their activities. So here's a map of Suffolk, 1645-46. And I shaded in pink the parishes and villages in which the witch finders carried out their activities. The darker reds, there were more than 5 witches found. In the lighter shaded pinks, that's where under 5 witches were discovered. And there's evidence now, and it's accepted evidence, that John Stern, living at Lawshall, where the star on the left is, near Bury St Edmunds, he worked alone on the west side of the county. And those are the names of the parishes in which they strutted their stuff. And Matthew Hopkins, based just over the border in Manningtree, worked the east side of the county. And those are the parishes in which they discovered, in total, 120 women and 19 men who were, in fact, going to be convicted of, who would be found by the justices of the peace to have a case to answer to, be referred to the assize court in August of 1645 in Suffolk. I've worked out using a modern map exactly how far in total these 2 men had to travel using the modern road system with and in that summer of 1645 they traveled no less than a minimum of 260 miles. Almost impossible for one man, Matthew Hopkins, to do it. And so we're pretty certain now that John Stern worked the west of the county and Matthew Hopkins the east of the county. And so we push on to the next slide. We need to now start looking at the background. So what are the methods that they condoned and encouraged to get the evidence? As I've said, one of them was the swimming of a witch. The thinking behind swimming of a witch, here's a contemporary print, is that water is pure. If the woman, or occasionally the man who was accused of being a witch, was innocent and they threw them into, in this case, a mill pond, and they sunk to the bottom, then they were innocent, but chances are they drowned. If they were actually guilty of being a witch, of being evil, in league with the devil, then they would float. And it's quite interesting to see here that the 2 guys each side of the banks of the mill pond have actually got ropes tied to the witch. The witch was trussed up naked. Her right thumb would be tied to her left big toe. Her left thumb would be tied to her right big toe. She'd then be trussed up with ropes and thrown into the pond. It's quite interesting that they've got ropes around her. A little bit of tension on the rope, again, would probably mean that she didn't sink. And of course, if she didn't sink, she was guilty. You've got magistrates standing on the side of the mill pond there, and floating in what appears to be a bucket or a tub is probably the parson, the preacher, watching the goings on, because we know that religion did play quite a big part in this. The magistrates in Suffolk, to their credit, initially Hopkins used the swimming method to get his evidence that the person was the witch. The magistrates in Suffolk decided that this was not acceptable evidence, and they banned the swimming, or at least if the witch was swum and there was and she floated, they wouldn't accept that as evidence. So swimming was one of the early methods that Hopkins and presumably Stern used to determine guilt, or determine that the woman is a witch. You've got to determine the woman is a witch before you can accuse her of doing stuff with her witchcraft. So the most important thing is to get the evidence totally definite that this woman is a witch. So the other method that was used, if we can go to the next slide. And we know from Hopkins, he was a great believer in this, searching for witches' marks and hopefully at the same time seeing the witches' familiars. And as I said, Hopkins was a great believer, perhaps many people were as well, that witches had the supernumerary marks somewhere on their body, sometimes hidden quite intimate places where they could suckle their imps. The imps, for nourishment, had to feed on the blood of the witch, who the devil make the contract. When the witch made a contract with the devil, we'll come on to that in a moment, he would give her imps. They could be frogs, toads, they could be anything from bumblebees to flies to dogs, toads, cats, you name it. If it was a creepy crawly or a living creature that could familiar, an imp could take the form of that particular creature. So here we have some of the strange imps that Hopkins claimed that he actually saw in Essex. And here is a contemporary print from another witch trial, nothing to do with Hopkins, showing a witch with her imps that she apparently feeding, and one of the imps is called Jack and the other one's called Jill. And so the idea was that if you could put the witch into a room in isolation and watch her, keep her awake, not let her lay down on the floor, sit her on a stool with just a plain shift on her, just a long lightweight gown on her, and in the middle of an empty room, and have somebody watch her, then eventually her familiars, her imps, would have to come to her to feed, because that's the only way they got nourishment. That way you would get the evidence that she was indeed a witch, because you saw the imps. The idea as well was that the woman shouldn't be allowed to ruck down, as they called it back in the day, lay down on the floor, because once she was on the floor, if the imp was some very small creature, it might be able to sneak up under her clothes and nobody see her. So they would sit her on the stool and keep her there, sometimes for days and nights. And if she looked as she was about to fall asleep, they would, two sturdy guards who would be watching her, would lift her up onto her feet and briskly walk her up and down the room to wake her up again, then sit her down. This would go on constantly until such time as A, the imps appeared, or B, the woman confessed. Torture under common law wasn't allowed in this country, but that's a form of torture that's been used time out of mind, even to the present day, waking and walking somebody to eventually break them down. There's no record in any of the confessions or any of the testimonies that anybody ever saw an imp, but many of the women after this process of watching and walking did actually confess under duress, obviously, although it wasn't seen as that. So if we go on to the next screen, please. So here, yeah, a bit closer so I can read it. I'm not going to read all of these out. These are just some examples of imps and familiars that. So if you look on when you see on the screen there, in brackets in italics, that's the name of the witch. This is the information that's all come from the magistrate's clerk's notes that accompanied these people to their trial. So he's noting these down as evidence is being given to the magistrates, and he notes that she confessed that three things came to her: one like a rat, cold and ragged as she felt on him, the next like a mole, soft and cold, and the third like a mouse, and that the mole spoke to her in a great hollow voice and asked her to give her body and soul. The next woman, Margaret Powell from Stowmarket, and a true bill means that the grand jury, after hearing this, had decided she had to be tried and an indictment was drawn up. Margaret Powell of Stowmarket, she confessed after 6 days of being watched and walked that she had 3 imps sent to her from Mother Brown, another witch, and that had fed on her several times. And she tells us what their names are. Mary Winter of Wickham Market said that she had things that did trouble her but could not confess, and if she had any things, they came from Mother Green. She's pointing the finger at somebody else, and that she had a certain token, that's a witch's mark, found upon her upon searching. The grand jury found her ignorant of that charge, and she was acquitted and sent away from the courtroom. Lydia Taylor of Bramford, another one, she confessed that she was a witch, and that she had 2 imps, one like an owl and one like a blackbird. The imps kind of told her to steal, and they might counsel her to kill herself, and the devil did appear to her in the night. For some reason, again, the grand jury decided there wasn't enough evidence there. The note at the bottom of the screen is the name of the manuscript in the British Library in London, where all these original notes still exist. We push on to the next slide, please. There's a lot of ground to cover here. Now we get some of the interesting ones. Hopefully you could read some of these. I'm not going to read them all out, but we're getting some of the women. Margaret Bennett of Bacton, she freely confessed. So she wasn't put under any duress whatsoever. She quite openly confessed, possibly because she was frightened of being tortured by being watched and walked and possibly even swum. She freely confessed that she met the devil, that she came from Newton with a long cloak, and that she knew him by his feet, cloven feet, I don't know. It was in the daytime, and we get, again, if you go back to these, you could read these things in more detail. I'm going to go over them quite quickly. A true bill was found, and she had to stand trial. Another woman who freely confessed at her liberty, i.e. nobody was watching her or walking her. She, Alice Warner of Rushmore, she freely confessed that she had entertained certain evil spirits, which had sucked her, and she employed them to carry lice to Wright's wife and one Barney's, etc., etc. We go to the next slide. I got quite a lot of these. There's 139 of these. Some women actually said that they met the devil himself in the devil. Maria Bush of Bacton, she freely confessed. Once again, there seems to have been no torture in any way, shape, or form. The devil did appear to her in the shape of a man about 15 years since, so 3 weeks after the death of her husband, and had after the use of her body. A true bill. That was in actual fact found. She was, in fact, sent by the grand jury for trial. Margaret Sparham of Linstead, she freely confessed, again, doesn't seem to be under any duration, she met the devil in the wood in the likeness of a black man. And the devil told her that there would come a man to her to search for imps. A true bill was found. She stood trial, and she was one of the unfortunate ones who were found guilty by the jury at Bury St Edmunds in August 1645 and hanged. Thomasine Ratcliffe as Shelley, she again freely confessed there came one to her in the likeness of a man who got into bed with her, which spoke with a hollow, shrill voice. That's not even been endorsed by the grand jury. We don't know what happened there. We continue on to the next slide, please. I'll get through these. So you can come back to these later and read them through. Mary Scrutton of Framlingham, she confessed on the night that she was taken, arrested, that she had 3 imps that sucked her several times this 3 or 4 months. And her husband got concerned, and he said to her, "You company with witches and you're plagued with some of their imps." She says the devil appeared to her twice, once like a bear, once like a cat. He tempted her in a hollow voice to kill her child. A true bill. Anne Alderman, Chatterson. These are the names of some of the neighbours who gave evidence against her. They testified that she confessed the first day she was arrested, without being watched, without etc. It says in the thing, either without being watched or walked, that she had 3 imps, grasshopper, mouse, squirrel, and that she was a witch, and she had been almost 8 years, and that she had these imps from Mother Cottrell. Cotnell. She's pointing the finger at a neighbour who she says is a witch as well. We go on to the next slide. As I say, you probably want to come back to some of these. Alice Warner of Rushmere confessed after 3 nights and days of watching. After an hour's sleep, they let her have a kip after 3 days and nights with keeping her awake. In the sickness about 12 years since, the devil tempted her to make away with her children, or else she should always continue poor. And he demanded a covenant, which she did deny, but she carried one of her children. And this is really sad in actual fact. This is what this woman is actually confessing to. She carried one of her children, laid it close to the fire to burn it, and went to bed again. And the fire burnt the hair and head lining, and she heard it cry, but could not have the power to help it. But one other children pulled it away, and the next time the devil came to her, he demanded her to seal the covenant, and she consented to him against her will and sealed it with blood, with her blood. He promised her that she should find 10 shillings in a bush for sealing the covenant, but she never got it, apparently. Again, found a true bill. It makes you wonder, really, what is actually going through the minds of these women. We can hear their voices, these cries. I mean, that's a subject all on itself, as to exactly who the devil is that's tempting them. Is it an imaginary person, or is it their own conscience? I can't really go into that. That could be a discussion. If we could have an open discussion at some point, it would be a really good thing. A true bill. Anne Palmer confessed the first night she was taken that she had 2 imps like turkey cocks. One she called Great Turkey and the other one Little Turkey. Not very imaginative. Again, she fingers another so-called witch in the village there. And but this charge is thrown out by the grand jury. They find her ignorant of that charge. We push on. We nearly reached the end of these. There's 139 in actual fact to read. So anyway, that's just a tiny, tiny example of what the evidence, if that's the right word, that's being offered against these accused witches. The trial took place eventually. There's 139 of them now been arrested and shipped down to Bury St Edmunds to stand trial. The trial took place on Tuesday, the 26th of August, 1645. It wasn't actually before a judge a fully qualified judge. The Civil War is in process. It's difficult to get judges. So a minor judge, a sergeant at law, John Godbolt, was appointed. And these assizes had to have a commission from Westminster to hold the assize. They couldn't suddenly say, right, guys, we're going to have an assize. The High Court in Westminster issued a commission, and here we find that a special commission of Oyer and Terminer to hear and determine was issued to Sergeant John Godbolt on the 26th of July 1645, enabling him to convene an assize court at Bury St Edmunds. And to help him in the courtroom, we had these two local parsons, Reverend Samuel Fairclough and the Reverend Edmund Calamy, both of whom we know did play a part in pointing the finger at witches in Suffolk. So we don't really have a biased. John Godbolt himself was a Suffolk man as well. They obviously got the people locally rather than from London because of the Civil War. And the whole trial was held in front of the Grand Jury House. So we go to the next slide, please. After the trial, this pamphlet was issued, and it's a tribulation of the arraignment of 18 witches. These are the witches who were hanged at Bury St Edmunds when they were found guilty by the Court of Oyer and Terminer to hear and determine. And these are the names. How they were singled out, they seem to be fairly random people. Obviously, the jury found them guilty. They were sentenced to death, and they were hanged at Bury St Edmunds on the 27th day of August 1645. These were from all over the county. There's some 2, 3, 4 from Halesworth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 from Chatterton, and they were executed at Bury St Edmunds. And here it's not their execution, but a contemporary woodcut of an execution taking place, and you can see it was quite a brutal practice. The hangman, executioner, would tie at the foot of the gallows, the goalpost like gallows. He would tie the noose, or the halter as they called it, with a slip knot round the neck of the next woman to be hanged, or the man, because there was a couple of men hanged at Bury here. And he would then throw that person over his shoulder with a noose round her neck, go up the ladder, tie the loose end round the crossbeam of the gallows, and then literally just toss her off his shoulder to kick and struggle at the end of the rope. And there you can see him checking the one he's just hanged. There is the bellman ringing the bell and reading out why these people are being hung. There the magistrates on horseback watching the proceedings to make sure that everything is going according to plan. There's the witch finder on the right being paid, because we're coming on to that in a moment. And there's a couple of guards there watching the whole procedure. So that's the awful end product of Matthew Hopkins and John Stearns' activities. Pushing on to the next slide then, please. And if you watch my last of witch trials talk, you'll have seen this slide. This is where the witches were hanged. There was an ancient burial mound called the Thinghow on Sharehouse Heath to the north of the town of Bury St Edmunds, and that was the traditional place that had been since Saxon times to hold the courts and to hang people. The courts moved in, I think it was the 15th century, actually into the centre of Bury, but they continued to take people up to the Shire House Heath. You see, Highland House is quite interesting. It was actually a burial mound. Is it called Highland House because it was actually built on the top of the Binghow, which was higher than elsewhere? That's just pure speculation. I don't know, but certainly the 20 and spending hours and hours trying to figure out. In the background there, you can see Highland House. This is a view from the road. There's now a road leading past Highland House, a cul-de-sac called, I think it's called Highland Close, or just Highlands. And it's somewhere just in this vicinity, perhaps a little bit further back behind these trees, where the execution took place. Whether that area still has the ghosts of these unfortunate women, I don't know. This is quite moving. The first box to the right there, this is an extract from this pamphlet that says, the person who wrote in the pamphlet says, as I remember, when there were 18 to be executed, most of them kept in a barn together. They made a covenant amongst themselves not to confess a word next day at the gallows, where they were when they were to be hanged, notwithstanding they had formally confessed. And it goes on to say, and some of them after they came into the jail, and some before the bench in the country, but most of them, if not all of them, before the justices of the peace. So you can see the due process being referred to here. But most of them, and so died next day, accordingly very desperately, except one present woman who reviews their covenant or agreement. So she made it known that she was guilty, presumably. But she told them, the court, how these witches waiting to be hanged, these 18 so-called witches, in a barn the night before they were hanged, made a covenant not to confess when they were hanged. And once they'd made this covenant, how they made a sing of psalms after they had done it. So here you get this poignant scene of these 18 people locked in the barn to be hanged the next morning, a covenant saying we're not going to confess at the gallows, and then they all start to sing psalms. I find that quite moving, probably led by 80-year-old the Reverend John Lewes, the parson of Brandeston, who was hanged with them as well. And you can see his name on the top, outlined in red. Fortunately, the pamphlet tells us, besides these 120 more suspected witches in prison at St Edmundsbury, at Bury St Edmunds, who had all their trial now, but that the judge and the justices were compelled to adjourn the said sessions till another time by reason of the near approaching of the Cavaliers of the Royalist army. And so they abandoned the trial. And one of the difficult things to see is what happened to these 120. The assizes abandoned. It's going to be March, April the following year before a new assize court could be convened. And it seems as either the whole thing petered out, and these 120 women and men who were accused were never hanged. A quick word about John Lewes, if we go on to the next slide, please. Just pull my headphones out. John Lewes was the rector of the parson at All Saints of Brandeston, 80 years old, before being watched. And we're told he was watched for 8 days and nights. He was actually swum in the moat of Framlingham Castle by Hopkins. Hopkins particularly took this guy's case on. And eyewitnesses said or heard stories. One of them says, I have heard from them that watched him that they kept him awake several nights together and ran him backwards and forwards about the room until he was out of breath. Then they rested him a little, and then they ran him again. And thus they did for several days and nights together till he was weary of his life and scarce sensible of what he said or did. And somebody else says, Hopkins, his chief accuser, kept ye poor old man wakened several nights till he was delirious, and then confessed such familiarity with the devil. Another account that I found says that he was barefoot, and by the time they'd finished, his feet were torn and bleeding. And yet the authorities say torture wasn't permitted. That's a moot point, I think. So we go to the next slide, if you go to Brandeston Church, a plaque was erected there in his memory. Victor of Brandeston, 1896, 1645, hanged age 80 for witchcraft on the evidence of Matthew Hopkins, self-appointed witchfinder general at Bury St Edmunds. Protesting his innocence, he read his own funeral service to ensure a Christian burial. And there's a quote under there by the steward of the manor of Brandeston, 1712. May no such blind and bloody superstition and madness ever get ahead again within this land. So that's poor Reverend John Lewis. There is a whole story about him as well. Another case that took place, Ipswich were able, because of their charter, to try their own witches. And in September 1645, we're pretty certain these were victims of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern. Two women were found guilty, and one, Alice Denham, was hanged at the Cornhill in Ipswich. The other one, Mary Mother Lakeland, she was actually burnt at the stake. The reason she was burnt at the stake, she was found guilty of using her witchcraft, not only of killing some neighbours, but also her husband. That was petty treason. Petty treason was punishable by burning at the stake. Now, whether she was burnt alive, we don't know. The record doesn't tell us. Whether she was hanged and then symbolically burned, we don't know. But certainly she was one of the exceptions during the Hopkins reign of terror who were actually burnt because she'd murdered her husband using her witchcraft. So we'll push on again because still got a fair bit of ground to cover, and I'm conscious of the past. So what's going on? What are the motives behind this? We'll never really know. We can surmise. Right, Matthew Hopkins got paid, and we know that because in August 1645, the burghers, the men running Great Yarmouth, decided to send for him because to see if there was any witches in Great Yarmouth. Now, Great Yarmouth again is an exception, just great like Ipswich, because it had a charter. It was able, under that charter, to try its own felons. It didn't have to send them to the assize court. It could try its own felons. We'll come across a couple more like that in a moment. And in the Great Yarmouth Assembly book, 15th of August 1645, it is noted, it is agreed that the gentleman, Mr. Hopkins, employed in the country for discovering and finding out witches, shall be sent for to come to town to make search for such wicked persons, if any be here, and shall have his fee and allowances for his pains and labour in that ends, as he has in other places in the country. So he's being paid. We know he's being paid. We'll see later he does admit it himself. So we go to the next slide, please. And the trial took place in the toll house. This remains of the late medieval toll house there. tried by a jury of Yarmouth people before the mayor and burgesses of the town, but because they had no actual legal standing, they had to have a lawyer known as the recorder to sit in to make sure everything was carried out correctly. And that lawyer was this rather nasty piece of work by the name of Miles Corbett, a fully qualified barrister, and he was appointed to be the recorder of Great Yarmouth to oversee the proceedings. By all accounts, not a particularly nice guy. One of the ministers, the nonconformist minister, the Puritan minister, the Reverend John Brinsley of Great Yarmouth, also took part in the trial. So this is Great Yarmouth, and of course they managed to find witches. And if we go to the next, the trial takes place. Corbett oversees it. Here is one of the pages from the Great Yarmouth court records, all in Latin. And on the 10th of December 1645, the following people were tried. And we know Hopkins was there. We know he was sent for. There's no problem with that at all. Mark Prime, Barbara Wilkinson, Nazareth Fassett, Mary Vervey was acquitted. Elizabeth Bradwell, Alice Clipwell, Elizabeth Dudgeon, Bridget Harwood, and Mary Blackthorne were all hanged for some reason. And on the original document, the bottom of the page, you can't read it properly, tells us that she was sentenced to be hanged, but reprieved at the last minute. We don't know why. And on the left-hand side are the original court records with the verdicts written in the column. So unfortunately, we don't actually have a lot of detail about what the witches were accused of, only that of what they actually did to finish up being in the court, just that they were using witchcraft to injure people. Indictments don't actually give you the details of the crimes. Unlike the notes from the magistrate's clerk, the actual indictments don't give us chapter and verse as they do in Suffolk, the ones that we've gone through earlier from the clerk's, the magistrate's clerk's notes. So here, as I say, there was another trial. Now we go on to the next slide, please. I'm trying to get through these as soon as I Aldborough was another town that had the ability to try its own felons. And Nathaniel Bacon, a magistrate and lawyer from Ipswich, was the recorder there. So the town council are trying the witches. And now we can see Matthew Hopkins. This is from the accounts of Aldborough accounts. The witches were tried on the 7th of January 1646. And these are the accounts book. And we can see here we have first-hand evidence that Hopkins was being paid, because he'd been paid out of the coffers of the Aldborough town. And so we see that on the 8th of September, he was given a gratuity, a payment of £2 for being in town finding out witches. Goody Phillips, that's obviously Mary Phillips, the search woman, she's paid. Being a woman, she only gets half of what he gets, given to Goody Phillips. Then for her pains searching out witches, £1, and then paid to sundry men for watching days and nights with such as were apprehended as witches, 13 and 10pence. So it's not Hopkins who's just getting paid, or the search woman. Just if you're doing a job and a job happens to be watching witches in case their imps appear, then you get paid for it. This doesn't seem to be voluntary work. And even more so, if we go to the next slide, we can see from the accounts of Aldborough, again, this is a very poor copy. The originals are in the Suffolk Record Office. You can't see the right-hand column with the amounts, so you're going to have to take my word for this. But again, we can indicate there, on the 20th of December that same year, Hopkins was back and got another £2. Widow Phillips was back, the search woman. She got another £1. Mr. Johnson, he paid Mr. Skinner's man for fetching Widow Phillips, the search woman, presumably from Manningtree, 12 and 8pence. Mr. Hopkins has paid again a gratuity for giving evidence against the witches in the jail on the 7th of January, another £2. Given to Widow Phillips, the search woman, for giving her evidence against the witches in the town, £1 5s. Paid 6 men to ward at the sessions and execution. These are the guards, the guys you saw with the halberds standing by the gallows. They were given, they did it for 2.5 days and were given 12pence per day, all came to 13 shillings and 8pence. On top of that, Hopkins and presumably Goody Phillips stayed for a couple of days overnight, and we have another entry here. Another payment was made to Mrs. Holdine. She kept the I think the inn was the Angel Inn at Aldborough, and she was paid a total of £4 7 s. That's a hell of a lot of money back in the day, for diet and wine when Mr. Hopkins was in town, and for charges for the witches. They had to pay to feed the witches in jail as well. So Mrs. Holdine made £4 7 out of that, a fair amount of money. And the cost in Aldborough didn't stop there. These are fascinating records in my book. We go to the next one. The next slide, please. So here from the Aldborough accounts again, everybody got paid apparently. And in a second, hopefully, if this thing is working properly, each of the entries will come up. There we've got John Payne, the hangman, I think the name, paid 11 shillings for hanging 7 witches. William Daniel, for putting up the gallows, he got 8 shillings. 6 shillings was paid for a post set by the grave of the dead bodies that were hanged. And here we are, Henry Lawrence, the roper, for 7 halters and for making the nooses. He was paid 8 shillings. And paid for watching with Widow Wade. Why she was singled out for watching, we don't know, another 3 shillings. So the whole town is having to shell out a lot of money, not just to Hopkins and Goody Phillips, but to all the people involved in the trial and the execution. If we go to the next slide, you see, so expensive was this trial that another, in the receipts book at Aldborough, it shows us that at the bottom here, 2 of the bailiffs in March and again in May that same year had to collect £4 each in extra rates paid to cover the expenses. A colleague of mine, Professor Malcolm Gaskill, has calculated that when you add up everything that was spent, 1/7 of the whole yearly budget of Aldborough, the town budget, was actually spent on trying these 7 witches. So we'll push on again. In Stowmarket, very similar thing. We had one, Elizabeth Hobart, Richard Foreman, William Keeble, Margaret Powell, Mother Brown, Goody Mills, Goody Lowe were all found, were discovered there, thanks to Matthew Hopkins. And again, he racked up a fair old bill, according to a historian from Stowmarket. And the Hollingsworth, in his history of Stowmarket, says records show that when Hopkins was staying in Stowmarket, he received a total of £23 and 6p for his work there. Another 9 and 6p was paid to Mr. William Wage of Stowmarket for the entertaining of Hopkins at his inn. So Hopkins stayed overnight. So great were the expenses that the town had to levy a special rate on its 93 ratepayers to raise the money a total of £28.03 to pay Hopkins' commission. So Hopkins is raking up a fair bit of money here, not only just being paid for finding the witches, but for his wine, his food, and his accommodation when he visits the larger towns. So we push on again. We'll see the people of Stowmarket weren't particularly happy with this. And we go to the next slide. Again, this is from the Suffolk, from the Quarter Sessions Minutes book. And here's one of the entries. Again, shortly, there's a translation coming up of that. It's in English, but it's easy to read that. It tells us basically that several persons in the parish of Stowmarket had to make a payment towards a rate made for the charges of witches. The court does order that all and every of the inhabitants of the town of Stowmarket shall upon sight of this order pay unto the now constables of said town several sums and rates as aforesaid towards the charges for the witches. It seems as if some people are refusing because it's a threat here from the magistrates, the Quarter Session, saying that if they don't pay up the money to the constable to cover the expenses, then they're going to have to appear before justices of the peace themselves to make good their sureties or to tell them why they don't intend to pay the money. So the ratepayers weren't particularly happy with the fact that they had to shell out money to foot the bill for the for the trial of the witches. Again, if we move on to the next slide. Hopkins then moves out of Suffolk and he goes up to King's Lynn in Norfolk. King's Lynn again was a self-governing town under its charter. So just like Aldeburgh, Ipswich and Great Yarmouth, it didn't have to send its felons to the assize court. It could try its own felons with a recorder who would oversee the sessions. And again, from the town records, we read that on the 11th of May 1646, it was ordered that Alderman Rivet be requested to send for Mr. Hopkins, the witch discoverer, to come to Lynn and his charges and recompense. And the next entry is very interesting. 2nd of September, it was ordered that Mr. Hopkins shall have £15. That's a hell of a large sum of money paid him out of this house towards his pains for his charges to this day in discovering the witches, and he is to discharge and pay all charges upon those occasions, and is to have further satisfaction after the next sessions, which £15 is delivered to Mr. Mayor to be paid to the said Mr. Hopkins. So it looks like he could benefit to the total of £30 here if he did things right. Other money that was paid out, they sent a man and a horse together with a drummer to fetch Mr. Hopkins, the witch finder. That cost him £2. And then Captain River, one of the aldermen, he was reimbursed with monies laid out for a messenger to St. Neots. I think that's St. Neots in Cambridgeshire, not far away, to speak with Mr. Hopkins, the witch finder, and for other charges, £1.13. So Hopkins didn't come cheap, and presumably neither did Stern. Stern doesn't feature much in this at all. I'll come back to Stern in a moment if we got time. So we go to the next slide. Kingston, 24th of September 1646, the trial took place of the witches that Hopkins has been sent for to discover. And here's the original page from the trial record, same format. But of course, who is their recorder? None other than Miles Corbett himself. Miles Corbett is doing well at this. And he apparently was not a very nice man. He was a very cruel, very dyed-in-the-wool, strict Puritan, quite what his views on witchcraft were, we don't know, but certainly he was overseeing the trial there. And Hopkins doesn't seem to have the same success as he had in other towns. These are the people that were tried. The two in red, Grace Wright and Dorothy Lee, were hanged, but the others were all acquitted by the court. One in particular must have been a little bit of an embarrassment for Matthew Hopkins. Makes you wonder whether he got all his money in the end, because you can't see it there, but my little red arrow actually points to his name. In the column on the left-hand side here are the names of those that are giving evidence. And Matthew Hopkins gave evidence against Thomas Dempster, but Thomas Dempster was acquitted and discharged. So of the all of the witches that were tried, only two fortunately were hanged, and Thomas Dempster must have left Matthew Hopkins with egg on his face after giving evidence as the witch finder himself, and only to have the jury decide that his evidence was rubbish, and they threw the charges out. We change slides again, please. Yeah, sorry, can we go on to the next slide? There we go. And Grace Wright and Dorothy Lee were hanged where felons had been hanged for generations on the Tuesday marketplace at King's Lynn. It has to be said that prior to this, nothing to do with Hopkins, but in the late 1500s and early 1600s, long before Hopkins was born, there were some other witches hanged at Bury St Edmunds as well. So we have evidence here that money is changing hands big time. Let's go to the next slide. So here's Hopkins again. We come back to his discovery of witches. And he mentions being paid. And if I can just find the right section in his book. Yeah, here we go. I'll read it out from the book. I've got the copy. This is from here. I mean, this is this question and answer thing where he's asking rhetorical questions and then answering them himself. And there is right. So he says, oh yeah, query 14. All that the witch finder doth is to fleece the country of their money, and therefore rides and goes to towns to have employment, and promiseth them fair promises, and it may be doth nothing for it. And so, and he's saying that all you're doing is going around here to get money for it. And his answer is, judge how he fleeces the country. Now, this is Matthew Hopkins answering it. Remember the amounts of money that we know he's been paid. Judge how he fleeces the country and enriches himself by considering the vast sum, he's being sarcastic here, the vast sum he takes of every town he demands. But 20 shillings of a town, £1 a town, and doth sometimes ride 20 miles for that, and hath no more for all his charges thither and back again, and it may be stays a week there, and find 3 or 4 witches, or if it be one cheap enough. And this is the great sum he takes to maintain his company with 3 horses. So he's saying no matter where he went, and no matter how many witches he found, he only got £1 per town. What about the 30 quid at King's Lynn, Mr. Hopkins? What about the money you paid? You were paid, I think it's £6 at Aldborough. So it just goes to show there is something a little bit dishonest about this man right from the start. We got the evidence from records that, as we've seen, that he didn't. He got far more than £1 per town or parish that he visited. So I'll leave that one with you. We're getting nearly to the end of this now. If we just go on to the next slide. These are very quick again. Here's again from the Suffolk Quarter Sessions minute books, when we said when you were in jail, you had to pay for your own board and lodgings, your own board and keep. And here we find 19th of October 1645, the jailer at Ipswich is complaining that he never got the witches who were imprisoned there had no money and couldn't pay for their board and lodgings, and he's complaining to the magistrates that they will raise some rates and charges so that he can actually be paid, etc., etc. So, and the same thing happens elsewhere. In the next slide, as I'm going through these quite rapidly now, you can go back and look at these in far more detail at any time. We also get here from the same Quarter Sessions order book. Here's the original. Here's my transcript of it. Here it comes. The inhabitants of Copdock and James Rigg, the jailer at Ipswich, says, upon hearing the differences this day between the inhabitants of Copdock in the county and James Rigg, the now jailer of Ipswich, for payment of the charges of witches, it is decreed that after in actual fact, what they're saying is the inhabitants of Copdock saying, we don't have any witches in your jail, Mr. Riggs at Ipswich, so why should we make some contribution towards their upkeep, which you've had to pay for? And again, if you go to the next slide, the same thing is happening here. People are saying, again, it's from the Quarter Sessions order book here, the inhabitants of other villages round are complaining because they're raising a rate across the county. The Quarter Sessions did that. That was before we had a county council. They're raising a county rate, parish by parish, to pay for the trial and to reimburse the jailer at Ipswich. And here we got the inhabitants of Horham, Branston and Allington in Suffolk saying, have complained to the magistrates and the Quarter Sessions that they don't see why they should pay any money into these rates, because none of their people were discovered to be witches. They were never tried, so there was no expenses incurred. So they're refusing to pay money into the rates. Some of this money possibly was owed to Hopkins and Stern, as we shall see. So we go to the next slide again. We're getting to the end here now. Again, Stern goes on at great length about being paid. This is a really touchy subject. He pays 61 here. He says, oh, wrong page, that's right. Yeah, he says, whoever thou beest that thinkest I ever made gain, either money, by way of favour, any, by the way, such gain of the way, or favoured any, and persecuted others, or took bribes, I called God to witness that, considering the charge of going to several places, the assizes and the jail deliveries, and the time I expended thereabouts, I never one time with another got so much as I did by my calling and practice. That means in his daytime job, which wasn't the witch finder, towards the maintenance of my family. And as for taking any money or other thing by way of bribe or gift, I never did to the value of 1 penny, neither one way nor other, but what I openly took in the view of the townsmen where I came, and that in many places I never received a penny yet. So he's complaining he ain't been paid by the towns and villages in which he discovered witches. And he says the only way he thinks he might get satisfaction for what money is owed is he should sue the county. But many rather fall upon me for what hath been received. But I hope such suits will be disannulled. So it seems as some people, in actual fact, were actually trying to sue him for the money that he's been paid. So money does play a big part in this, but I think it's a lot deeper than that. So we go on now. We come and just wait to the end. This has gone. So we just come to the latter days now. What happened? Why did this all grind to a halt or slow down? And what happened to? It's all down to really, as far as Hopkins is concerned, by John Gall, a preacher of Great Staunton in Huntingdon. Apparently, Matthew Hopkins wrote to Staunton saying in 1646, saying Huntingdon was going to be, the county of Huntingdon, and particularly Great Staunton, was going to be the next place he came to seek out witches. And John Gall, obviously a much broad-minded, down-to-earth preacher, actually published this pamphlet attacking Matthew Hopkins and attacking Hopkins' activities. And he writes in one sentence, "It is strange to tell what superstitious opinions, affections, relations are generally arisen amongst us since the witch finders came into the country." He's also, I suppose, reading between the lines and reading this pamphlet, he's actually accusing Hopkins and Stern of whipping up feelings against the witches, or possible witches, or stirring up stories of witchcraft, etc. He's obviously there. Hopkins apparently wrote back to him and said, accused him of basically being a witch. But interestingly enough, he never went to Great Staunton to carry out his threats. And this is where his career, for want of a better word, seems to have ended. Because if we go to the next slide, this is in 1646, this is written. The last record we have of Hopkins, not with witch trials, is actual fact his burial. And here's the entry in the Mystery with Manning Tree burial register for 1647. And we read there that Matthew Hopkins, son of Mr. James Hopkins, minister of Wenham. So we know this confirms what I said right at the beginning, was buried at Mistley on August the 12th, 1647. And there were rumours that he was swum as a witch and drowned, that he was found, someone who found a list of all the witches in Suffolk, and his name was on it. Stern, in his book, Confirmation of Witchcraft, refutes this, and he says, and so it says the thing is, just flick that, just read it. And he tells us anyway that Hopkins died of a natural consumption, and the which was common amongst generations of his family. So what this consumption, this consuming disease was, we don't know. But so at the age of 26, 27, after best part of 2 years in Essex and then Suffolk and through into Norfolk, Hopkins finally died and was buried here at St Mary's Church, Mistley. St Mary's Church is gone. It fell into ruin a couple of 100 years ago. The church ruins are just the remains of a few flint walls, and the graveyard It's usually there's no gravestones there whatsoever, but it's somewhere in that grassy sward that Matthew Hopkins' mortal remains lay today. And finally, if we come to Stern, what happened to Stern? He continued for a while in Cambridgeshire and Isle of Ely after the death of Hopkins, but his stuff seemed to have petered out. And again, if we go to my penultimate slide, we know from the record of All Saints Church in Lawshall that's where he settled after his marriage to Agnes, and that's where he lived with his wife. And as you can see, these are the names of his children that were baptized there between 1644 and 1662. In fact, the last child, Dorothy, was born at Lawshall on the 13th of December 1660. Hopkins, there's his burial entry in the register. He was buried the 20th of January 1671, and it's difficult to read, but I'm pretty certain that his occupation, possibly the same as we speculated on Matthew Hopkins, he too was a small town sort of lawyer, a scrivener. The word after his name, you can see quite clearly, John Stern, and then I'm pretty certain that's a rather misspelt scrivener. And that would explain again, as a small town lawyer, no real legal training, but he would have knowledge of the law, how he got involved in the witch trials. So he was buried there on the 20th of January 1671. And that has just about brought me to the end of tonight's talk. It's gone on slightly longer than I intended. If we could just flick on to the next slide. I think I'm coming to the end of it. Yeah. What I've done is I've compiled a list of all of the names of the victims of Hopkins and Stern: Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, the Isle of Ely, and these are the names of all of the victims. And the red ones are people who were hanged. Quite a sobering list. Each one of these is an individual, whether they were hanged or suffered the ultimate fate, or whether they were just bullied and persecuted by Hopkins and Stern and all the witnesses against them. These are people who suffered to a greater or lesser degree at the hands of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern across East Anglia. And so I think perhaps this next statement sums things up. Aldous Huxley, right in the book The Devils of Loudon, says, "For a clever man, nothing is easier to find arguments that will convince him that he is doing right when he is doing and it's gone what he wants to do." So that's there. And I just need to thank the information that's come from the Suffolk Record Office over the years, the Norfolk Archives Centre, and I would particularly, if we can go back to full screen, Professor Malcolm Gaskill, his wonderful book I would recommend if you want to read the full story. I was fortunate I worked with Malcolm on a TV program some years back called Witchfinders, and also shared some of my research with him for this wonderful tome. There we are. If we can we pull it? There we go. Witchfinders, Malcolm Gaskill. A beautiful book, a well-written book, a well-readable book. He doesn't know I'm promoting this, by the way. I can't claim that I wrote it. He did ask me to read the proofs for it, and I did a lot of research into the witch trials at Bacton in Suffolk, just one parish, trying to reconstruct the families involved there. And he used quite a lot of my research in his book, but I would recommend that. It's Malcolm Gaskill, Witchfinders, a 17th century English tragedy, and it's published by John Murray. I would recommend that. And he doesn't know that I promoted it, but as I say, we've worked as a team on that. Anyway, that's it. Longer than I thought it was going to last, but I hope you haven't all fallen asleep or gone to bed.
Well, I certainly haven't, Ivan, and I think you provided a very sobering prosecution of Stern and Hopkins, and much long needed it is. But yeah, I think you take on very well the role of trial that they should have had, really, rather than the trials that they were able to implement on the innocent victims you've named. And as you said, so chilling and so desperate. The account, I mean, the one that stands in my mind is of the lady, I think her name was Hazel of Rushmere, the lady that put her infant by the fire and its hair was burned. And
yep, that got me. If I just a quick word on that, I don't want to that. You see, the thing about it is the role of women back in the day was different. The good wife and mother, and God is normally an all-seeing person, and they're religious as well. So she's poor, obviously, and the devil tells her, or she thinks, if I can kill my children, I won't be poor anymore. So she's driven to do that by laying her child in front of the fire, hoping it's going to die. Another one of the children rescues her. So who put that thought into her head? It couldn't have been God. It must have been the devil. So is she confessing that I was possessed by the devil to do this? You know, they're only little tiny tidbits. There's a lot of the ones there, and I've only touched on the thing where a woman, a married woman or a widow, confesses that she's had sexual intercourse with the devil. Now, if you're a married woman and you get a lover in your bed, and you shouldn't have a lover in your bed because you're a good wife and a mother, who puts that idea into your head that you should do that? Was that man the devil who enticed you? And I'm wondering if there's not more to this, a lot deeper. I've actually written quite a long paper on that subject, but perhaps one day I'll try and get published. But there's so many layers to this. Just common vengeance from neighbours against people they don't like, religious, being driven by the Bible, what it says in the Bible. I mean, all of those references that Stern puts in his book justifying, or the references to the quotes in the Bible that he puts in his book to justify what he's saying, means that he must have been quite deeply religious or just looking for an excuse. But then he must have read his Bible from cover to cover many times to be able to pick them all out. So you've got religion, you've got conscience, you've got vindictiveness, you've got everything playing a part. You've got money from the part of the witchfinders, so you've got the motive of the witchfinders, but then you've got the motive of the witnesses, and then of course you've got the women who freely confessed. Why did they freely? Was it they didn't want to be watched and walked and possibly swum in the early stages, or was it because they truly believed that they were witches? So I don't know. That's all rhetorical questions.
It's hard to know. I mean, I think it's important to, we may never understand, but it doesn't hurt to try, does it? I think in regards to that first lady, Hazel of Rushmere, I imagine what we'd call that now is postnatal depression or postpartum depression. And certainly there's a lot of mental illness at play, and perhaps Stern and Hopkins themselves were touched by sort of a malady of the mind.
Yeah, that's right. And how many of those, we don't know their ages. I managed to work out when I did my research into Bacton, I went through all I think there was about 8 witches at Bacton who were found. And we know their names, and we know the names of their accusers, again, from the notes made by the clerk. I went down to to the record office at Ipswich and went through the Bacton parish registers and the Bacton parish records, the Bacton parish manor books, and I could actually start reconstructing the community. And it turned out one of their biggest, 2 of their biggest accusers were actually the lord of the manor and the parson. And the women who were being accused were quite poor and impoverished, and they lived on the fringes of the parish, not in the village itself. So again, you've just got. So how many of them are actually were possibly suffering from mild dementia? Yeah, perhaps some of them really did believe that they were witches, and there were. Hopkins, witch finder general, as I said, there were no such thing. It wasn't against the law to be a witch, only when you used your magic, your witchcraft, to hurt or destroy property, people, goods, whatever. So it's it just seems to me that there were white witches. They were cunning folk who would turn that charm I put up there was kind of some sort of it wasn't a nasty one. It was actually to help somebody. I forget the details without going into that. That's another story on its own, that particular case in Norwich. But that person who had written that charm and had found that it was to help somebody do something. There's quite a lot of Christian references in there and what have you. And also the sigils or sigils drawn on it, the magical symbols. They weren't found guilty of using that charm. They were found guilty of using their witchcraft to hurt somebody, and that charm was used as evidence that they were a witch. That was proof. So, so there were people who believed that the cunning folk, as they were called. Anyway, I think that's done me tonight. That was fun, though. I hope.
I'm not surprised. You've done wonderfully, Ivan. I'm just going to let you know some of the thanks that we've received. Linda Boyce, thank you, Ivan. A fascinating presentation. Steve Fingleton says, great. Thanks, Ivan, for all the detail. Jackie Draper says, thank you. Learning more with each presentation. Karen Godbold says, fascinating insight into this part of our local history. Really enjoyable. Thank you. Chris Collins says, thank you very much, Ivan. What a lot of information tonight. Jerry Poole says, these poor women never stood a chance. And actually, Chris Collins says, one of my ancestors was Joan Lingwood of Great Yarmouth. I believe she was tried twice. And, well, I shouldn't think there were many that were tried twice. So she must be of some note if she was. I'm just going to there are lots of comments that I won't have time to whip through tonight, Ivan, but please be assured that lots of people have really, enjoyed isn't quite the right word, but have really been fascinated by tonight's presentation. So thank you very much. We look forward to the next episode, number 18, which will be in a fortnight's time. That's Monday, the 12th of October. And it is titled Aspects of Lowestoft's History. And once again, we'll be very, very glad to welcome Mr. Ivan Bunn. Ivan, thank you very much, my man. Have a good night.
Okay, thank you. Just before everybody goes, I just had that talk, just like all the other 16 that are done, is still available through Facebook or YouTube. I had to, obviously, to keep this talk short enough, some of the, especially the evidence that was offered, I skimmed through that very quickly. If you're interested, you could go back and have another read of that and just read it slowly and focus on this confessions that these women were making. As I said, there's only about 10 or a dozen out of 139. The 139 that I've got in this book, taken from the original records. But, you know, I would suggest, if you want to just get a little bit better feel for this so-called evidence, to go back to the talk tonight and just read them through slowly and just try and think about exactly why and what are these women actually confessing to. So I say no more.
Thank you, Ivan. You take care. See you in a fortnight's time.
Okay, and you. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night. And I'll just finish off by mentioning you can find Ivan's books at Waterstones. There's this one, A Trial of Witches by Gilbert Guise and Ivan Bunn. There's Haunted Lowestoft, A Return to Haunted Lowestoft by Ivan Bunn and Henry Baker. There is The Trial of the Lowestoft Witches, a facsimile of the original report of the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Callender, with a foreword by Ivan Bunn and edited by Henry Baker. Now, some of you will remember the trial of Amy Denny and Rose Callender was the topic of a talk previously by Ivan earlier on in our series, of which this is number 17. And the final book that you can get at Waterstones or hopefully your independent bookstore as well is George Borrow, Alton and Beyond. By who's it by? Oh yeah, Mr. Ivan Bunn. So get yourself down to the bookstores when they open and see what you can get your hands on in time for Halloween. Couple more interesting comments to read out is that we've got one here from Frankie Swan. Really interesting and engaging. Love learning about the witches and witch hunters. Thank you, Frankie. I think you're a new viewer for us tonight. Nice to know you're out there. One other thing I just want to mention to everybody is that some of you may not know, but we often host a cuppa and a chat, which is basically a cuppa and a chat. You bring the cuppa, we'll bring the chat. And what we do is, as our parent organization, the Voice Cloud, we host a Zoom session whereby we give you the link. You can click on the link and we're all in an online room with like-minded good people. And yeah, just bring your favorite cuppa and we'll chat about some different things. We might have a bit of a quiz. If Barry's there, which I hope he will be, he sometimes brings a mystery object, which is always good fun for me because I can never get it right. So if you're free on Friday, the 2nd of October, which is this Friday coming, between 1:30 and 3:30 p.m., then have a look on our Facebook page of the Voice Cloud and you will find the link for the Zoom meeting, and we'll all get together. We'll have a drink, we'll have a chat, we'll have a bit of a laugh. If you've been having a bad day, you just let us know and we'll chat it through and hopefully make it better. As I say, the link is available on our Facebook page, and if you can't find it, then just send us a Facebook message and join us. You'd be very welcome. We'd be delighted to have you. Thanks everybody, and thanks to Ivan. Good night.